In this video, I'm going to walk through how to take an API written in Python using Fast API and deploy it as a public-facing API service in AWS App Runner. If you aren't familiar with App Runner, it's a service that enables developers to take their code or container image and have App Runner manage the load balancing, deployments, scaling, and monitoring of the service. Yes, it is really that simple. So let's dive right into the demo and we'll see how it works. In the meantime, if you want to read more about App Runner, you can head to the site below, which will give you insight into pricing, some frequently asked questions, as well as some of the high-level benefits of using AWS App Runner. Now, with that said, we're going to be navigating to this repository in GitHub, which is github.com/AdamJKeller/simple App Runner demo. And this is a walkthrough, and you have two choices when navigating in this walkthrough. And basically, you have two choices when you deploy your services or your code to AWS App Runner. There's the source code-based service or the image-based service. Now, the source code-based service is essentially where you just point your App Runner service to a source code repository in GitHub. You choose the runtime, Python, Java, Node, JavaScript, and so on. That basically corresponds to your programming language. You define the build commands and then the run command, and that's it. Behind the scenes, AWS App Runner is going to build a container image from your code, and it's going to deploy that service as a container on your behalf. The second option is to deploy an image-based service. So an image-based service is essentially taking your App Runner service and pointing it to a container image that lives in Amazon ECR. And what will happen is App Runner will just deploy that service, and every time a new instance of that service comes up, it's going to pull from that container image. So for today's demo, we're going to walk through the source code-based service. So to navigate through either of the approaches, you simply expand which one you want to go through. So again, here's the source code-based service. So now we're going to go into the console, and you can see here we have the Create an App Runner service button. That's where we're going to start. Now, I promise you this moves really fast because it really is that easy to get your service up and running. So when I click Create an App Runner service, I'm prompted with how do I want to source my application? Is it through a container registry, which is the source image, or do I want to use source code, which would be in GitHub? So we're going to check source code repository. Now, what you'll notice here is you have to pick a connector to GitHub. So this is, if you haven't done this yet, this is something you'll want to do because you can't move forward until you do this. And essentially what this does is it creates a connection between App Runner and GitHub. So App Runner can clone the repository and build and create the container image from your code base. So we're going to choose Simple App Runner Demo. Now, if you're following my walkthrough, I would recommend when you create your connector, fork this repository and point to that repository. Okay, don't point to mine, fork it and point to your own. So I've chose the repository and the branch, which is main. Okay. Now we have our deployment settings. We have two options. So I mentioned earlier, AWS App Runner takes care of the deployments for your code and your service. Now there's two options. One, I can do a manual trigger, which basically when I'm ready to deploy, I push a button in App Runner, I make an API call to App Runner, whether that's via the SDK, the AWS CLI, and so on, and that will trigger a deployment. There's also the option to have an automated deployment. When I choose automated deployments, App Runner is going to build a CI/CD pipeline behind the scenes. And every time I push a commit to that branch, so main branch in this instance, it will automatically trigger a build and deployment of the App Runner service with my latest code changes. Now, the cool thing is behind the scenes, I don't have to think about the deployment logic. How do I want to deploy? Do I want to do a blue-green rolling deployment? What is that? How do I get all that set up? App Runner takes care of that. And behind the scenes, App Runner actually does a blue-green deployment. So we'll look at that in just a moment. So for now, I'm just going to trigger manual or check manual. But if you want to have some fun on your own, make it automatic, make a small change to the main.py, and then push that change to the main branch, and then you should be able to see the deployment take place. So we're going to click next. Now here's where I configure the settings. There are two ways that I can configure settings when using AWS App Runner. I can configure the settings in the console when I build my service, which would be I choose my runtime, which is Python. I have my build command. So, my build command is going to be pip install -r requirements.txt. This is where all the dependency modules are listed for my Python application. If I was using Node, it would be npm install, and so on. So I could do this here in the console, which is a very simplified way to do it. But what I think is a better practice is as you start to use App Runner more and more, and you want to make your deployments more reproducible and have multiple environments for your services and so on, you'd probably want to use the configuration file approach. And this is where App Runner will actually, when it configures your service, the build command, the start command, it's going to look at that configuration file. So that's a small, very simple YAML file, which actually I have an example here that I'll show, that essentially has all that stuff that I mentioned plus more. So if I wanted to add tests or any type of additional commands to my configuration, I could do it here. And again, I think this is a better practice to build more reproducible environments. That way you don't have to keep clicking in the console every time. But for the first time working through the console, I think this is a really great experience because it helps you to understand how App Runner is going to actually build and run your application. So as you can see here, I chose my runtime, which is Python 3, my build command, which is going to be pip install requirements.txt. And then what is the start command? So how do I start my application? Now I could just have it, my start command be Python main.py because my code lives in the main.py file. Or I can use this command, which I'm using Uvicorn. And since we're installing that in the requirements as a dependency, I can just have that be my start command here. So I'm setting the host, the port, log level, as well as how to run my application. So we're going to do that. So that's our start command. And then we're going to keep it at port 8080. And that's it. So notice here, I haven't had to build a container image. There's no Docker build. There's no Docker run, Docker push. I'm not doing any of that. I am just saying, here's where my code lives. Here's how you install my dependencies. And then here's how you run my application. So we're going to click next. We're going to name this App Runner Demo video. And here's where I can choose the virtual CPU and memory. So I have a choice of 1 or 2 vCPUs and anywhere between 2 and 4 gigs of RAM. So I'm going to go with the lowest settings for now. There's a lot of configurations I can make to my service, and that's auto scaling. So auto scaling by default has a kind of a default set of concurrency and requests that we will choose to scale your application in and out. So that's 100 concurrent requests, minimum size of 1 instance, all the way up to 25 instances that it will scale in and out to. You can change this if you need to. So you don't have to stick with the default, but in this case, I'm going to stick with the default. But the one thing that doesn't change is the concurrency model for scaling. So App Runner uses concurrency, so concurrent requests to your application as the metric for scaling in and out. Then we can configure our health check. We can set up some security on the App Runner service, and specifically in 2 places. One, if we want to encrypt our code at rest using our own KMS key, we can do that, and we can set that key here. And 2, if I want to attach an instance role. An instance role is essentially an IAM role that will be attached to your App Runner instance. Okay, so remember, your instance could be anywhere from 1 to 25 based on scaling. And that instance will actually have an IAM role attached to it that will enable it to communicate with other AWS services. So an example here would be DynamoDB. If you need to talk to a DynamoDB table, how do you do that in AWS? You do that through an AWS SDK call. And that requires identity and access management policies that permit you to do so. So this is where you would do that. Secrets manager, if you need to pull a secret into your code, you would define that permission in that IAM policy, that role, and then attach that role to your App Runner instance. App Runner service, I should say. I won't dive too much into networking, but this is where if your service needed to connect to resources in your own VPC. So by default, App Runner is a publicly exposed, when it deploys your service, that service is available on the internet. It's publicly exposed. And it doesn't have access to anything internally or any like AWS resources within your account unless from an identity and access management perspective, you grant that access when you attach that role. But from a network perspective, if you need to connect to resources in a VPC, you're going to want to use the VPC connector. I'm not going to dive into that today, but this is all defined here in the custom VPC section in networking, which can enable that connection to, let's say you have an RDS cluster running inside of your VPC, Postgres cluster or MySQL cluster. That's network communication that you have to have security groups. If those are it's always recommended that, you run your databases in private subnets, don't just expose them out on the internet. So this will open that communication so you can communicate with that database or, an Elasticache cluster, a service even running an ECS that's in private subnets and you communicate over service discovery, you can do that with a VPC connector as well. And then tags, because of course you should tag your resources for cost purposes and just tracking purposes as well. So we have this, we're going to stick with this. One thing I'm going to do is add an environment variable. So in the walkthrough here, I do mention the environment variable, which is somewhere here, which is demo env. So what we're going to do is set that key there. And then the value will be, I deployed this live during the video. Yay. So what I've done here is I am just passing an environment variable to my application that when my application runs, it looks for this environment variable. If it exists, we're going to print this output as a part of the response. And we'll see that shortly. So we're going to go ahead and click next. And that's it. So we can review our configuration, and then we're going to hit create and deploy. Now, this takes a few minutes to deploy, especially the first time. After the first time, the deployment's much faster. But let's keep in mind that what's happening behind the scenes is App Runner's building all of the resources to support your service. So under the covers of AWS App Runner, it's running, your application is running as a container image. So App Runner actually builds a container image. It has to build the pipelines, the metrics, all of the things that it needs to, monitor and run your service. And then it actually deploys them to AWS Fargate on Amazon ECS. Now, I say this just to give you an understanding of what's happening behind the scenes, but you as the user and the operator of the App Runner service, this is all abstracted from you. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about auto scaling, creating all the metrics and setting up scaling policies and all the challenges that come with that. That's all just built in. So while it's building, what I want to do is run through the console, the experience, what that looks like. So you as an operator can understand where to go when things don't work as you expect, or when you want to see what's happening with the deployment and so on. So it starts with the main page for your service, which is always will default to the logs tab. And the logs tab is where we can see the event logs. And event logs are going to be anything related to your service that is outside of your application logs. So a deployment event, scaling events, service being created, and so on. That's all going to be here. So right when you hit this console, That's what you're going to see first and foremost. And then we have our deployment logs. So you can see for every deployment that occurs, you can check the logs in real time to see what's happening. So, I mentioned you don't have to worry about a Docker build, Docker run, Docker push, all these things, because App Runner does it for you. But if you have ever done a Docker build on your own, this will look very familiar to you, because the outputs are exactly what you would see if you were to run Docker build locally on your machine. So you can see we build the image. We're actually pushing that image to a repository behind the scenes. That's housed in Elastic Container Registry, Amazon ECR, and that's it. So you don't have to worry about any of this build automation or this build logic. It's all just there and being done on your behalf. Once our application's up and running, all of our application logs, so that's the standard out, standard error, that's going to be viewable right down here in the application log section. So as you can see, I don't have any yet because my service isn't up and running yet. But you can already see what's happening in the event log, where it built our image based off of our source code. It is provisioning instances, it's deploying the image, and now it's health checking on the port of my service. So all of this stuff that is generally more complex to build on your own is all abstracted away, and you're not thinking about it. You're just thinking about, can I get my app running, and making sure that my application is working as I expect. Now, another thing to note here is I mentioned that this is a public-facing service. At this time, when you deploy an App Runner service, it is going to always be a public-facing endpoint. That's at this time. Down the road, things may change where you may have the ability to deploy a service that lives in a private VPC or a private environment. But at this time, App Runner services are public-facing when you deploy them. So taking a look at our event log, you can see the health check was successful, and now it's starting to route traffic. Before I go to that, let's just look at some of the other tabs. So the activity tab, which will basically show me the timestamp and the operation that occurred. So deployment, create service, and so on. That's all here. And then our service metrics. So these are metrics that, again, come out of the box with App Runner. I can see my request count, 200 responses, 400 responses, 500 response count, and so on, latency, as well as the active instances. So with App Runner, you pay for the instance while it's running. And basically with the auto scaling is you're going to pay for the resources while you use them when it scales out. But once it scales back in, you don't pay for those anymore. So that will show here so you can see scaling events, in a more linear fashion and a nice graph to better understand how your application's scaling. Now you can see my service is created successfully and it's all done. We'll take a look in a moment. Then we have our configuration tab. So this is to just look up everything related to our service. So our repository, the branch we point to, that GitHub connection we've set up, how we want to deploy, and then our build settings for our configuration. So it's all here, everything that we wanted to see. And we can always change that here with these edit buttons to modify any of the configuration settings that we need. And lastly, there's the custom domains tab. If you want to point this to a custom domain, you absolutely can. Basically, you just click link domain. You say, here's my domain. App Runner will provide some records that you need to put in your hosted zone, and it will do automated validation. Once that's validated, it's going to automatically point to your URL, your domain name. So let's go back. We can see our service is deployed and it's up and running. So I can look here. I have application logs now. I can see here's my application up and running. Let's click the URL to see what it looks like. So we're going to zoom in. And there you go. So hello from App Runner. You set this environment variable. Remember, I deployed this live during the video. Yay. So there you have it. Now, in this short time, let's recap what I was able to do. I had a source code repository that has an application. It's an API written in Python that serves, off of the root of the URL, the endpoint, basically just returns a response, every time it's hit. I said to App Runner, here's how you build my dependencies, and here's all the things I need installed in order for my code to run. I said, here's how you run my code, and here's the port you run it on. And that was it. And then I defined some configuration values. I set an environment variable, and I clicked create, and everything was created behind the scenes for me, and I didn't have to do anything on my own that was difficult. So, parting words here to think about. I didn't create an orchestrator. I'm not managing a container orchestrator. I'm not managing how to auto scale my containers and my code. The metrics and monitoring, I don't have to create any custom metrics. They're available out of the box. Now, of course, if you want to, you can do that as well. Everything I needed was there, built in, out the door. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out on Twitter at RealAdamJKeller. You can submit comments or issues on the GitHub repository. And if there's anything else that you want to see, you want to see a demo of, please reach out. I'm glad to build a demo to help show off any of our functionality, to help make it easier for y'all to get started. So thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next video.